The T-34 tank shuddered to a halt, its track severed by German anti-tank fire. Inside the steel coffin, smoke filled the cramped compartment as shells screamed overhead, detonating in fountains of frozen earth across the winter battlefield. It was November 1943, somewhere in the blood-soaked fields west of Smolensk, and Mariya Oktyabrskaya had a decision to make. She could stay inside, wait for recovery crews, hope the Germans didn't score a direct hit while her tank sat immobilized, a perfect target against the white snow, or she could do what no other tank driver would dare. She popped the hatch. Machine gun fire chattered across the battlefield as the 38-year-old woman climbed out onto the exposed armor plating of her T-34. Her crewmates shouted at her to get back inside, that she'd be killed, that this was madness. But Mariya Oktyabrskaya hadn't sold everything she owned, her clothes, her furniture, her wedding ring, to die sitting still. She dropped to the ground and crawled under the tank. German soldiers, positioned in trenches 400 meters away, saw the movement. Rifles cracked. Bullets whined off the tank's armor and kicked up snow around her body as she worked with bare hands in temperatures well below freezing. The track was damaged, but not destroyed. If she could reconnect the pins, reset the tension, the tank could move again. Her fingers, numb from cold and slick with grease, worked the heavy steel components. Another shell burst close enough that the concussion wave pressed her against the frozen mud. Shrapnel pinged against the tank's undercarriage. She kept working. 10 minutes. 15. Her crew lost sight of her in the smoke and assumed the worst. Then the hatch clanged shut from inside, and the engine roared back to life. "Fighting girlfriend is back in action." Her voice crackled over the radio, using the name she'd personally painted on the turret. The T-34 lurched forward, track repaired, and resumed its advance on the German position. When her battalion finally secured the field that evening, her commanding officer found Mariya inside the tank, hands still black with grease, a slight smile on her face. He demanded to know what had possessed her to climb out under fire. "The tank is mine," she said simply. "I paid for it. I'll fix it." To understand how a Soviet woman came to personally own a tank in the middle of the Great Patriotic War, you have to go back to 1941, before the repair under fire, before the battles, before everything fell apart. Mariya Oktyabrskaya was not a soldier. She was not a revolutionary firebrand or a career Communist Party operative. She was a telephone operator, and later a housewife, married to a Soviet military officer named Mariya Oktyabrskaya. They lived a quiet, comfortable life, by Soviet standards, moving between military postings as his career advanced. She learned to drive. She studied nursing. She became a crack shot with a rifle, a skill many Soviet civilians cultivated in the increasingly militarized society of the 1930s. But mostly, she was simply a wife. They had no children. In the photographs that survive from before the war, Mariya appears as a handsome woman with dark hair pulled back, serious eyes, and the kind of face that suggested competence rather than softness. She wore the modest dresses of the era. She kept house. She wrote letters, and she loved her husband. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, Ilya was stationed near the western border. Like millions of Soviet soldiers in those first catastrophic months, he was thrown into a meat grinder of encirclements, retreats, and desperate defensive battles against a Wehrmacht that seemed unstoppable. Mariya evacuated east with other military families, waited for letters. They stopped coming in August. For weeks, she had no information. The Soviet bureaucracy, overwhelmed by millions of casualties and the chaos of retreat, couldn't tell her anything. Missing, possibly captured, status unknown. The phrases meant nothing and everything. The official notification arrived in early 1942. Her husband, Colonel Mariya Oktyabrskaya, had been killed in action near Kiev in August 1941, dead for months, and she was only learning it now. Grief affects different people in different ways. Some collapse inward, some go numb, some channel their devastation into rage. Mariya Oktyabrskaya chose vengeance. She was 36 years old, alone, living in the Tomsk region of Siberia, where she'd been evacuated. Around her, the entire Soviet Union was mobilizing for total war. Women worked in factories, on farms, in hospitals. Some even fought. The Soviet Union would ultimately deploy women as snipers, machine gunners, pilots, tank crews, and anti-aircraft gunners in numbers no other nation matched. But Mariya wanted more than to work in a factory. She wanted to kill the men who had killed her husband, and she wanted to do it personally, directly, with her own hands on the controls. She decided to buy a tank. This sounds absurd until you understand the Soviet war financing system. The Red Army accepted donations from citizens, organizations, and collectives to fund specific pieces of military equipment. A factory could pool money to buy a tank, which would then bear their name. Collective farms purchased aircraft. Individual wealthy citizens donated funds for weapons. The cost of a T-34 medium tank in 1943 was approximately 50,000 rubles, a staggering sum, equivalent to several years of an average worker's salary. Mariya sold everything: her furniture, her clothes, her personal possessions, everything she and Ilya had accumulated over their marriage. She kept only what she could carry. The most painful sale was her wedding ring, the last physical connection to the man she'd loved. When she had the money, she sent a telegram directly to the State Defense Committee, essentially to Stalin himself. My husband was killed in action, defending the motherland. I want revenge on the fascist dogs for his death and for the death of Soviet people tortured by the fascist barbarians. For this purpose, I've deposited all my personal savings, 50,000 rubles, to the National Bank in order to build a tank. I kindly ask to name the tank Fighting Girlfriend and to send me to the front line as a driver of said tank. It was an extraordinary request. Women drove tanks in the Red Army, but usually as part of all-female crews or in desperate circumstances. A middle-aged widow with no military experience demanding to personally crew the tank she'd purchased was unprecedented. The request went up the chain of command. Officers debated. Some thought it was a publicity stunt opportunity, a grieving widow's patriotic donation. Others saw a potential propaganda disaster if she was immediately killed. The response came back. Request approved. Report for training. The Omsk Tank School, autumn 1942. Mariya Oktyabrskaya stood in a motor pool surrounded by tanks and men half her age who looked at her like she was insane. But the Soviet Union in 1943 had moved beyond conventional standards. The country had lost millions of men. Entire cities had been erased. The Germans had penetrated to the outskirts of Moscow, to Stalingrad, to the Caucasus. Conventional was a luxury the Soviets could no longer afford, so they trained her. The T-34 was not a comfortable machine. It was cramped, loud, poorly ventilated, and required brutal physical strength to operate. The clutch and gear levers demanded serious muscle. The interior reached oven-like temperatures in summer and freezing cold in winter. Visibility was terrible. Communication was difficult. The life expectancy of Soviet tank crews was measured in weeks. Mariya absorbed everything with grim determination. She mastered the driving controls, learned to execute tactical maneuvers, and studied mechanical repair. She qualified not just as a driver, but as a driver mechanic, someone who could maintain and repair the vehicle under field conditions. This latter skill would save her life. Her instructors noted that she was older, slower, and less physically strong than the male recruits. She was also more careful, more methodical, and absolutely fearless. She volunteered for every dangerous exercise. She stayed late to practice. She read technical manuals by lamplight. When asked why, she gave the same answer: "I want to kill the men who killed my husband." In October 1943, after nearly a year of training, Senior Sergeant Mariya Oktyabrskaya was assigned to the 26th Guards Tank Brigade and sent to the front. Her tank, fresh from the factory, bore the name she'd requested, painted in white Cyrillic letters on the turret: "Fighting Girlfriend." She was going to war. The first time Mariya drove her tank into combat was near Smolensk in October 1943, part of the massive Soviet offensive to liberate Belarusia. The landscape was a hell of mud, destroyed villages, and German defensive positions. The Wehrmacht, now on the defensive after the disaster at Kursk, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were losing. They were still extremely dangerous. Mariya's battalion received orders to assault a fortified German position. Trenches, machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, the standard deadly array. The T-34s would advance in formation, suppress the defenses, and allow the infantry to close. Inside the tank, Mariya sat in the driver's position, forward and low, peering through a narrow vision slit. The commander gave directions. The gunner aimed the 76mm main gun. The loader fed shells, and Mariya controlled this 26-ton steel beast as it rumbled toward the German lines. The noise inside a T-34 during combat is indescribable. The roar of the engine, the rattle of tracks, the concussion of your own gun firing, the clang of enemy rounds bouncing off armor. Radio communication was nearly impossible. The crew operated half-blind, choking on cordite smoke, relying on training and instinct. Mariya drove straight at the German trenches. Anti-tank rounds streaked past. One struck the glacis plate, the sloped front armor, and ricocheted away. The gunner fired, and a machine gun position erupted in smoke. Mariya adjusted course, bringing the tank's weight directly over a section of trench. The T-34 crashed through, collapsing the earthworks, crushing the position beneath its tracks. They destroyed 2 machine gun nests and a mortar position in that first engagement. When Mariya's tank finally withdrew after the infantry secured the position, she had tasted battle for the first time. That night, she wrote in her diary, "I've had my baptism by fire. I beat the bastards. Sometimes I'm on the front line with the infantry. Other times, I'm sniping at them. I won't give up." She had no intention of giving up. The following months, Mariya fought in multiple engagements as the Red Army ground westward. Her battalion participated in the liberation of Smolensk, pushed through Vitebsk, engaged in the brutal winter fighting of late 1943 and early 1944. Her reputation grew. Fellow tankers noted that the woman in Fighting Girlfriend never hesitated, never retreated, and seemed to possess a sixth sense for terrain. Her crew, initially skeptical of serving under a female driver twice their age, became fiercely loyal. But what really set her apart was the repairs. Modern audiences might not understand how vulnerable tanks were, how frequently they broke down, how often a severed track or damaged drive wheel could turn a mobile fortress into a stationary coffin. Most crews, if immobilized, would abandon the vehicle or wait for recovery teams. Mariya climbed out and fixed it, under fire, in the open, again and again. Her commanding officers, they needed her alive, not as a dead hero. But Mariya had a simple logic. The tank was hers. She'd paid for it with everything she owned, including her wedding ring. She wasn't going to let it sit broken while Germans shot at it. So when Fighting Girlfriend threw a track during an assault near Novoye Selo in November 1943, Mariya popped the hatch, climbed out into the hell of German defensive fire, and repaired it while bullets chewed up the ground around her. She did it again near Vitebsk, and again outside Orsha. Each time, Her crew watched in horror and awe as this middle-aged woman with grease-black hands and absolute determination crawled under the tank, worked the heavy mechanical components, and got them moving again. The Red Army newspaper, Pravda, got wind of her story. A grieving widow who sold everything to buy a tank and then drove it into battle herself, who repaired it under fire, who refused to leave the front lines. It was perfect propaganda. Her photograph appeared in newspapers. Radio broadcasts told her story. Letters arrived from Soviet citizens, inspired by her example. She was held up as a model of Soviet patriotism, female courage, and dedication to the war effort. Mariya didn't care about any of that. She had come to kill Germans, and she intended to kill as many as possible before they killed her. January 1944. The 26th Guards Tank Brigade was engaged in operations near Vitebsk, Belarus, part of the continuing Soviet offensive. The German army, though retreating, remained deadly. Every village, every crossroads, every frozen field was contested. On January 17th, Mariya's battalion attacked a German position near the village of Kozyrevo. Intelligence suggested moderate resistance. It was wrong. The Germans had prepared a killing ground, concealed anti-tank guns, dug-in infantry, pre-sighted artillery. When the Soviet tanks advanced, the trap snapped shut. Fighting girlfriend took a hit early. Not a penetration, but the concussion from a near-miss shell damaged the track assembly. The tank slewed to a halt, partially exposed, taking fire from multiple directions. Mariya's crew knew what was coming. She was already moving toward the hatch. "Don't do it," the commander said. "Not this time. Too much fire." She ignored him and climbed out. German machine gunners, dug in 300 meters away, saw her immediately. Tracers laced the air. Artillery shells, already falling across the battlefield, now adjusted fire. The Germans recognized Fighting Girlfriend, the propaganda tank, the widow's revenge machine. Destroying it would be a significant prize. Mariya dropped to the frozen ground and crawled beneath the tank. The track needed major work this time. Not a quick fix, but serious repair. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as the ground around her exploded. She'd been working for perhaps 5 minutes when the shell landed. It wasn't a direct hit. A direct hit would have killed her instantly. Instead, a German 88mm shell burst close enough that shrapnel tore through the air beneath the tank. Multiple fragments struck her. One piece of shell casing, no larger than a coin, penetrated her skull just behind the right ear. Her crew heard the explosion, saw her body jerk, and scrambled out despite the fire to pull her back inside. She was still conscious, still breathing, blood streaming from her head wound. "Did we kill them?" she asked. "Yes, we killed them." She lost consciousness. Mariya Oktyabrskaya didn't die that day on the battlefield. She died slowly, over 2 months, in a military hospital. The head wound was catastrophic. The shrapnel had penetrated her brain. In 1944, with battlefield medicine, there was nothing to be done but wait. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she knew where she was. Sometimes she thought she was back in the tank, calling for her crew. Sometimes she asked for Ilya. The Red Army, recognizing her inevitable death, began processing her for the highest award, Hero of the Soviet Union. The paperwork moved through channels. Her story was written up, her service record documented. On March 15, 1944, 2 months after taking the wound, Mariya Oktyabrskaya died. She was 38 years old. She had spent 5 months in combat, from October 1943 to January 1944, an eternity for a tank crew. On August 2, 1944, she was posthumously awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest decoration the nation could bestow. The citation noted her courage and heroism in battle and her exceptional bravery in repairing her tank under enemy fire. Fighting Girlfriend, her T-34, was repaired and returned to service. It fought for the rest of the war. In a detail that feels almost mythical, the tank survived the entire conflict and was eventually placed in a museum. The widow's revenge machine outlasted the war it was built to fight. It would be easy to dismiss Mariya Oktyabrskaya as a propaganda creation, a convenient story manufactured by the Soviet state to inspire the masses. And yes, the Soviet propaganda machine absolutely used her story for exactly that purpose. But the propaganda was built on truth. She genuinely did sell everything. She genuinely did buy a tank. She genuinely did drive it into combat, repeatedly, and repair it under fire, multiple times, until German shrapnel ended her war. Her impact on the Soviet war effort was both symbolic and practical. Symbolically, she represented what the USSR demanded of its citizens in the Great Patriotic War: total commitment, total sacrifice, everything for victory. If a 38-year-old widow could learn to drive a tank and fight on the front lines, it raised morale. It shamed those who weren't contributing enough. It proved that anyone could fight. Practically, her donations campaign inspired others. Following her example, other Soviet citizens pooled money to purchase tanks, aircraft, and weapons. The donor tank program expanded. Entire tank columns were funded by civilian contributions, factory workers, farmers, professional organizations. The People's Tank column became a feature of Soviet war financing. Mariya was the template. More importantly, her combat service demonstrated that determination could overcome the limitations others assumed. Soviet planners had been reluctant to deploy women in tanks, assuming they lacked the physical strength or temperament. Mariya proved otherwise. While the Soviet Union never formed all-female tank units on the scale of their female aviation regiments, individual women served in tank crews throughout the war, and Mariya's example helped open that door. In an era when women's contributions to the war effort were expanding rapidly across all nations, Mariya stood as evidence that there were no theoretical limits to what women could do when necessity demanded it. After the war, she became a minor cult figure. Streets in Russia and Ukraine were named after her. Memorials were erected. Her photograph appeared in museums. The Soviet state, always hungry for heroes, elevated her to the pantheon of great patriotic war legends. Not as famous as Zhukov or the defenders of Stalingrad, but remembered nonetheless. In modern Russia, her story is taught in schools. Fighting Girlfriend sits in the Transbaikal Regional Museum of Local Law in Ulan-Ude. Veterans organizations maintain her grave. She appears in books, documentaries, because ultimately, Mariya Oktyabrskaya's story isn't really about tanks or propaganda or Soviet ideology. It's about what grief can become when it transforms into purpose. It's about a woman who lost everything and decided that if she was going to die anyway, she'd die on her terms, behind the controls of a machine she owned, fighting the men who'd destroyed her life. She bought a tank with her wedding ring, and then she drove it into hell. She didn't come back, but Fighting Girlfriend did, battered, scarred, but undefeated, just like the country it fought for. In the calculus of World War II, where millions died in industrial-scale slaughter, one woman and one tank barely register. The Eastern Front was a clash of armies numbering in the millions, of thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, entire cities reduced to rubble. But wars are fought by individuals, by people with names and faces and stories, by widows who refuse to accept that their grief is the end of the story. Mariya Oktyabrskaya chose to make her grief into a weapon. She chose to transform her loss into action. She chose to fight, not because anyone forced her, but because she decided that sitting still while others fought was intolerable. And in making that choice, She became something more than a widow, more than a tank driver, more than a Soviet hero. She became proof that ordinary people, driven by extraordinary will, can change their own story, even in the middle of the worst war in human history, even if it costs them everything, even if the price is their life.